Democratic Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are sticking with Republicans in defending the filibuster rules. Democrats were hoping the change would allow them to pass federal voting legislation, but the two Democrats would not budge. In an opinion piece for The Hill, Michael Starr Hopkins wrote, "It is time for President Biden to stand up to them." He said President Biden has, quote, allowed Senators Sinema and Manchin to hijack the agenda and threaten to destroy his presidency. And Michael Starr Hopkins is with me now. He's a Democratic strategist and the founding partner of the public relation firm Northern Star Strategies. Michael, woo, this is a spicy op-ed you wrote. My goodness, you say that that the president is from a different generation, and that's okay. But the problem is we're not in that generation anymore. Customs have been trampled on, norms have been shattered, and coups have been attempted. These are trying times, and this country's tolerance for polite society and kumbaya moral victories is over. And you take the president, you take Senator Sinema and Manchin and everybody else really to task for this. So the gloves are off, and you say that there are different strategies that the president should be applying to Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema. Talk to us about why you think the strategy for Senator Sinema should be primarying her among the Democrats, withdrawing all financial support. And for Manchin, you think challenge him, and if he switches parties, so be it. Tell us why.
Look, Senator Manchin has kind of held this threat over the Democratic Party that if we don't work with him, that if we don't allow him to shape policy, then he'll leave the party. Well, go ahead and leave the party then. You can't allow someone to hold a party hostage, especially when we have Republicans attempting to coup the government. I mean, when you have people on January 6th storming the Capitol to stop an election, and you then have Democrats talking about their friends with the very people who supported that, there's something wrong with this country. Kyrsten Sinema voted down healthcare legislation and then proceeded on that very same day to go to a fundraiser where healthcare lobbyists gave her millions of dollars. The system's broken. And so it's time for Democrats to come out and say that it's broken and that we're going to do something about it and that we're going to fix it. And when these two senators are the precipice for why things are broken, the perfect example for why Americans don't trust our democracy, then we got to hold them accountable. And that's what I did in this column.
But explain the theory that you have about why it would be, if not fine, better to see Senator Manchin switch parties, which is something that most strategists say isn't going to happen. But why you think it'd be better for him to switch parties rather than remain a Democrat and, as you say, continue to insult the president and black voters. And you make it really personal in one point. You're talking about Manchin, when Manchin says Senate traditions are more important than making sure the children of Dr. Martin Luther King can still vote, or when Senator Sinema talks about how passing legislation that makes sure my grandmother can still vote is too divisive. Is there a benefit in having, you're a Democratic strategist, a Democrat still with that D and caucusing with Democrats, even if it means that they don't always agree?
Look, Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin vote with Democrats on over 80% of legislation, but that legislation is legislation that gets over 51% of the vote anyway. So Republicans are voting on most of that legislation in support of. But it's the important thing, it's the Voting Rights Act that really we're failing to see support from Manchin or Sinema. And that legislation is at its foundation what makes America great. You know, my grandmother was born before African Americans had the right to vote. She's lived through the Civil Rights Act and lived now through the first black president, and now risks seeing her not have the ability to vote because Democrats, not Republicans, but because Democrats believe that polite society, believe that being able to be supported by Republican lobbyists is more important than defending her right. Sinema should be primaried. Ruben Gallego should be the one to take that seat. And President Biden needs to not only commit to withdrawing funds from the DSCC, but needs to make sure the DNC isn't funding her, and needs to go to the top donors in the party in general, the big heavy hitters when it comes to donors, and tell them, if you donate to her, I will make sure that your life is a living hell, because that's what she's doing to African Americans all over the country.
And Michael, you argue that Senators Manchin and Sinema personally benefit from not supporting federal voting rights. How is that? Explain it.
Well, Senator Manchin, for example, is invested in coal companies in West Virginia. In Build Back Better and in the infrastructure bill, there is legislation which has to do with clean energy. If African Americans and more Americans across the country were given the right to vote, and by given, I mean protected, their right protected, then Senator Manchin would not be able to benefit. The same is true with Senator Sinema. She would not be a senator if we protected the right to vote in states like Arizona. And so it is their support of legislation which restricts the right to vote. It's their support of really apartheid-style, Jim Crow-style legislation which makes them sitting senators. And if I have anything to do about it, if I think progressives and activists and people who care about democracy have anything to do about it, that won't be the future.
So, Michael, before I let you go, I want to get your take on President Biden's promise to fill retiring Justice Breyer's seat with a black woman. Republican Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi said that would effectively be an affirmative action pick. What do you have to say about that assessment?
Well, I think that's ironic given that I think 100% of all senators from Mississippi have been white men, or at least white individuals. So if anything, he's a legacy hire. And when you look at the Supreme Court, you've got 95% of all Supreme Court justices being white individuals. And the only individual who's an African-American would be Clarence Thomas, who replaced the great Thurgood Marshall. And there, Republicans had nothing to say about affirmative action. Listen, black women have been the foundation of this country, have to work twice as hard to get half the respect. And so when people like Senator Wicker make comments like that, it shows more of who he is and less about who the next Supreme Court justice will be. Small men often have lots to say.
Well, I know you're urging President Biden that you think he ought to take his gloves off. It's clear your gloves are off. Michael Starr Hopkins, great to have you on the show. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.